My dad has a bike just like yours. 5 words. That's all it took. Ray Gravel Henson's coffee cup cracked against the table. His face drained white. 6 men who had ridden through danger without blinking sat completely frozen, staring at a waitress who had no idea she had just detonated something that had been buried for 12 years. She was still smiling. His bike is still in our garage, she said. Been sitting there since Mom died. Gravel's hands were shaking. Not from the cold, not from the road, from a name he hadn't let himself say out loud in over a decade. Michael Jensen was alive, and his daughter had just walked straight into the middle of everything. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go. It was a Tuesday, which meant the diner was quiet. That was the thing about Marcy's Roadside. It ran on a rhythm that most people in the county had memorized without even realizing it. Mondays were for truckers. Wednesdays brought the retired farmers who had nothing better to do than argue about weather and politics. But Tuesdays belonged to the bikers. They came rolling in around 2 in the afternoon, right after the lunch rush had died down and the place had gone soft and still. 6 of them, always the same 6, give or take 1 or 2, depending on who had somewhere else to be. They parked their bikes in a row along the far side of the lot, unhelmeted and unhurried, and they took up the big corner booth like they owned it, which in a way they sort of did. They had been coming here for going on 11 years. Sarah Jensen had been working the Tuesday shift for 3 of those years. She knew their orders by heart. Ray Henson, the one they called Gravel on account of his voice sounding like 2 rocks being ground together, always got black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of whatever pie was freshest. Big Dennis took a double cheeseburger, no onions, every single time without exception. Tommy Ricks, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and never talked about why, ordered a BLT and sweet tea. The others rotated, but Gravel and Dennis and Tommy never wavered, and Sarah had long since stopped asking. She liked them. That was the honest truth. A lot of people in town were uneasy about the Hells Angels coming through. There were whispers, there were always whispers when men like that showed up. But Sarah had never seen them be anything other than decent to her. They tipped well. They didn't cause trouble. And they talked to her like she was a real person, not just a pair of hands carrying plates. That Tuesday started no differently than any other. She carried the coffee pot over to their table, exchanging nods and quiet hellos, and she started pouring without being asked. Gravel was in the middle of saying something to Big Dennis about a stretch of highway out past Reno. Something about the road conditions being worse than he remembered, and Dennis was nodding in that slow, half-asleep way he had that didn't mean he wasn't listening. You hear about the construction on the 40 that Gravel was saying. They tore up about 6 miles of the good part, whole sections like riding over a gravel pit. Figures, Dennis said. Every time they fix something, they make it worse first. Sarah smiled and kept pouring. She had heard 100 versions of this conversation. Roads and weather and bad construction. These were the things bikers talked about when they weren't talking about something more serious. She had learned to listen without really listening the way you do when you spend enough years carrying coffee to the same people. And then Gravel said something that caught her attention without meaning to. He was describing a particular kind of bike, not the ones they were riding now, but an older model, a classic, the kind that barely existed anymore outside of someone's garage or a museum. He used a specific word to describe the sound of the engine, a particular phrase that Sarah had heard before, not from a biker, but from her father. She stopped pouring. My dad has a bike like that, she said. It came out casual, conversational. The kind of thing you say without thinking about it because it connects to something in your chest and your mouth forms the words before your brain has approved them. The table went quiet, not immediately. It took a half second, like the sound of a guitar string dying out, but it went quiet. And Sarah noticed because quiet at that table was not normal. These men had a background hum of conversation that never fully stopped, even when they weren't talking. There was always something, a chair shifting, a fork hitting a plate, Dennis cracking his knuckles. Something. But when she said those words, everything stopped. Gravel's eyes came up from his coffee. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She had seen him amused, she had seen him tired, she had seen him annoyed once when a car had blocked one of the bikes in the parking lot. But this was something different. This was a man trying very hard to keep his face together and not entirely succeeding. What did you say? His voice came out lower than usual, the gravel in it thicker somehow. Sarah blinked. I said my dad has a bike like that, the one you were describing, same model, I think. He's had it since before I was born. Nobody at the table moved. Your dad, Gravel said slowly, like he was testing the weight of each word before he set it down. What's your dad's name? Sarah tilted her head. It was a strange question. In 3 years, none of them had ever asked about her family. They talked to her, sure, but always about small things, the food, the weather, the road. Personal things stayed on the surface. Jensen, she said. Michael Jensen. The coffee pot in her hand suddenly felt very heavy. Gravel's face, that hard-weathered, seen-it-all face, cracked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like something out of a movie. It was subtle, the way a wall develops a crack before it falls, something shifting beneath the surface that nobody's quite ready for. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved away from her and then came back, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there a moment ago. Michael Jensen, he repeated. Yeah. She watched his face. You know him, Gravel didn't answer right away. Big Dennis had put down his burger. Tommy Ricks was staring at the table. The other 3 men were all looking at Gravel with expressions that told Sarah she had walked into something she didn't understand, something that had been sitting in this room long before she brought it in. We used to, Gravel said finally, a long time ago. Sarah didn't press it. She had learned in 3 years of serving men who carried their histories like closed fists that some things couldn't be asked about directly. You waited, you gave it air, and if it was going to come out, it would come out on its own terms. She filled their cups and moved away to take an order from the other end of the counter, but she could feel the temperature at the corner booth had changed. She could hear it in the way their voices had dropped, the way the conversation had shifted from easy and rolling to something tighter, more careful. She caught pieces of it on her second pass. Can't be the same guy. How many Michael Jensens you think rode with them in 2004? Jesus, Gravel, does she know? That last one she caught clearly because Tommy said it too loud and Gravel's look cut him off like a knife. She kept moving. She kept her face neutral. But her heart had started doing something strange. Something between fast and slow, like it couldn't decide whether to race or stop. Does she know what? She thought about her father and what she knew about him, which was she had always believed most of the important things. She knew he was quiet. She knew he had loved her mother with the kind of love that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that just arranged itself around another person's needs without being asked. She knew that when her mother got sick, something in him had gone somewhere she couldn't follow, and that he had never entirely come back from it. She knew the bike in the garage. She had grown up walking past that bike. It sat under a tarp in the back of the garage like something in a museum. Something preserved and untouched, waiting for a day that never came. She had asked her father about it once when she was maybe 13. He had given her the short version he used to ride, he didn't anymore, end of story. She had learned not to ask again. Gravel caught her on her way back to the kitchen. He hadn't left his seat. He had waited until she passed close enough, and then he said her name in that low, careful voice, and she stopped. Sarah. He looked at her straight. How is he, Michael? She thought about the question for a moment, how to answer it honestly without saying too much. He's alive, she said. He doesn't go out much. He works on the house. He watches TV. She paused. He's been alone since my mom died. That was almost 12 years ago now. Gravel nodded slowly. His hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, and she noticed again that they were not entirely steady. The bike's really still there, he asked. In the garage, yeah. I don't think he's touched it since before Mom got sick. She studied his face. Why? He looked down at the coffee cup. Then he looked back up. What did he tell you about us, he asked. About the people he used to ride with. Nothing, she said. He never talked about it. Something moved across Gravel's face, something she couldn't name, but it made him look older. It made him look like a man carrying a weight he had gotten so used to that he had stopped noticing it until just now, when someone had pointed it out. Nothing, he repeated very quietly. Not a word. Should he have told me something, she asked. The table had gone quiet again. All 5 of the other men were watching Gravel, not her, the way people watch someone who is about to say something important. Gravel opened his mouth. and then he closed it. He picked up his coffee cup and took a long, slow drink. Then he set it down and looked at Sarah with an expression that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite shame, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. No, he said. No, he probably shouldn't have. He paused, but someone should have talked to him. She thought about it for the rest of her shift. That's the thing about words that land in the chest. You can't unfeel them just because the conversation has moved on. Gravel had gone back to talking about the road, or pretending to, and the table had done its best to return to normal, but Sarah could see the effort it took. She could see it in the way Dennis kept looking at Gravel and then looking away. She could see it in the way Tommy had barely touched the second half of his BLT. Something was sitting in that corner booth with them that hadn't been there before, and it had her father's name on it. She refilled cups and cleared plates and smiled at her other customers, and the whole time she was running it through her mind. We used to know him a long time ago. Does she know? The way Gravel's hands shook. The way the question, how has he had come out like it was trying to be casual and failing. She had grown up believing her father's silence was just grief. Just the way some men process loss by going inward and staying there. She had made peace with it mostly. She had built her life around it the way you build a house with an odd-shaped room. You work with what you have. You stop wishing the walls were different, and eventually you stop seeing them at all. But now she was seeing something else. She was seeing a man at a table with his hands around a cracked coffee cup, looking like he'd seen a ghost and saying someone should have talked to him. Should have. Past tense. Which meant it hadn't happened. Which meant that whatever those men knew about her father, they had known it in silence for a very long time. They were getting ready to leave when she decided to do it. She had weighed it back and forth for the better part of an hour, and in the end, she did what she always did when she couldn't talk herself out of something. She stopped thinking and started moving. She walked over to the booth as Gravel was pulling on his jacket. "My dad's address," she said. She had written it on the back of her receipt. She held it out to him. Gravel looked at it. He didn't take it immediately. "You don't have to," she said. "But if you knew him, if you really knew him, I think he could use it." She kept her voice even the way she'd learned to keep it at her mother's bedside. "He doesn't have a lot of people left." Gravel looked at the slip of paper for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it. He looked at the address and something happened to his face again. That same quiet cracking, the same subterranean shift. "Hartley Road," he said. "Dead-end street. You know it." He didn't answer right away. He folded the receipt and put it in his jacket pocket with the care of a man handling something that might break. "I knew a man who used to talk about buying a house out there someday," he said. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere off the main road." He looked at Sarah. He was very specific about it being a dead end. Said he liked the idea of a road that had a clear ending. Sarah stared at him. "That's where they built," she said quietly. "He and my mom. That's where I grew up." Gravel nodded once slowly, like a man confirming something he had known but hadn't been ready to say out loud until this moment. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." He pulled on his gloves. He looked at her one more time with those steady, burdened eyes. "Tell me something," he said. "Does he still keep the lights on at night?" It was a strange question. It was a specific question, the kind of specific that doesn't come from nowhere. "Yeah," she said carefully. "Front porch. He never turns it off." Gravel closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and nodded. "Good," he said. "That's good." He turned and walked toward the door. Sarah stood by the booth and watched him go. She watched the 6 of them file out into the parking lot, mount their bikes, the familiar roar and rumble of engines starting up. She watched them pull out onto the main road. And for the first time in her adult life, standing in the middle of the diner she had worked in for 3 years, Sarah Jensen felt like she had been living next to a story she didn't know the first page of. She called her father that evening. She almost didn't. She went back and forth on it the whole drive home, the whole time she was making dinner, the whole first half of the evening news. Her father was not a man who handled unexpected calls well. He was not a man who handled most things well since her mother had gone. He existed in a kind of managed stillness that she had learned not to disturb unless she had a reason. But she had a reason now. She picked up the phone just after 8 o'clock. He answered on the 3rd ring the way he always did, never too fast, never too slow. "Hey, kiddo." Hey, Dad. She sat down on the couch. She hadn't planned how to start, which meant she was going to start wrong, which was fine. Starting wrong was how most honest conversations began. Can I ask you something? Sure, a pause. Something wrong? No. She took a breath. I had some customers at the diner today, a group of bikers. Silence on the other end. Not the quiet of someone thinking about what to say, the quiet of someone who has stopped breathing. Dad. Yeah, his voice was different, flatter. Go ahead. They knew your name. When I mentioned you had a bike like one of theirs, the guy Ray Henson, he went white, like I'd said something that hit him. She paused. He asked for your address, Dad. I gave it to him. I hope that's okay. Another silence. This one was longer. Ray Henson, her father said, not a question. Just the name turned over like a stone that had been sitting in the dark for a long time. Yeah, she said. They called him Gravel. She heard her father breathe out. It was a wussing, unsteady exhale, the kind that carries more than air with it. You gave him the address, he said. I did. I'm sorry if... No, His voice was quiet. No, don't apologize. Another long pause. It's all right, Sarah. But it wasn't all right. She could hear it. She could hear the 12 years of silence that had just been handed a name and an address, and she could hear what that silence was doing now that someone had disturbed it. Dad, she said carefully, who are these men to you? He didn't answer for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Quieter than the worst nights after her mother died. Quieter than the morning of the funeral. They were my brothers, he said. Or they were supposed to be. The line crackled. She asked. Sarah. He stopped. Started again. When your mom got sick, when things got bad, there were people who should have been there. People who knew what I was going through and had the ability to show up. Another pause. They didn't. She didn't say anything. She let it sit. I'm not angry anymore, he said. I want you to know that. I made my peace with it a long time ago. He took another breath. But some doors, once they close, they stay closed. You understand, Boyka? Yeah, she said. I understand. She did understand. She had understood for a long time that her father was a man built around a specific absence, that there were rooms inside him that he had locked and wallpapered over, that she had been careful her whole adult life not to accidentally knock on the wrong wall. But Gravel's hands had been shaking. Someone should have talked to him. The porch light still burning, a dead-end road chosen on purpose. A bike under a tarp that had never been sold, never been touched, just kept. Just preserved like something that wasn't finished yet. She didn't say any of that to her father. She said good night and told him she loved him, and after she hung up, she sat for a very long time in the quiet of her apartment, with the phone still warm in her hand. She thought about doors that stay closed. She thought about what it took to knock on one. And she thought about a man named Ray Henson folding a receipt with the care of something fragile, putting it in his jacket pocket, riding away into a Tuesday afternoon with 12 years of unfinished business pressing down on him like the whole weight of the road. Sneakum. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 6 miles away, pulled into a gas station off the county highway, 6 motorcycles were sitting idle. And Gravel was standing apart from the others, the receipt unfolded in his hand, staring at an address he had read 3 times already. You're going, Dennis said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Gravel said. When Gravel looked up from the paper, he looked at the road ahead, and then he looked back at the men behind him. His men, the men who had ridden with him for decades. The men who had been at that table 11 years ago when Michael Jensen's name had first gone quiet. Soon, he said, before I can talk myself out of it. Nobody argued. Nobody offered an alternative. Because every man at that gas station had the same weight in his chest, and every single one of them knew it, and none of them had known what to do with it, until a waitress with her father's eyes had said, my dad has a bike like yours, and cracked something open that had been sealed for far too long. Gravel folded the receipt again. He put it back in his pocket. He put on his helmet, and for the first time in 12 years, Ray Gravel Henson pointed himself toward a dead-end road. The drive out to Hartley Road took 23 minutes. Gravel knew because he counted. Not the miles, he had stopped counting miles a long time ago, but the minutes, because minutes felt different when you were driving towards something you had been avoiding for 12 years. Every minute had a weight to it. Every red light felt like a question he hadn't answered yet. Dennis rode behind him, then Tommy, then the others in their usual formation falling into line the way they always did without being told. Nobody had debated whether to come. Nobody had said, maybe give the man some warning, or maybe this isn't the right time. They had all mounted their bikes at that gas station and followed Gravel out onto the county road, because that was what you did. You followed your brother. Even when your brother was riding toward a mistake that was 12 years old and might not want to be found. The house at the end of Hartley Road was small and set back from the street. That was the first thing Gravel registered. The second thing he registered was the porch light burning steady in the early evening gray, exactly the way Sarah had said. He pulled to a stop at the end of the driveway and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and total. He sat on the bike for a moment without moving. Dennis pulled up beside him and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. The right thing to do was nothing, and Dennis had always known that. It was one of the reasons Gravel had ridden with him for 20 years. "You ready?" Tommy asked from behind. "No," Gravel said. He got off the bike anyway. He walked up the driveway with his helmet under his arm and his hands not entirely steady and the folded receipt still in his jacket pocket, even though he didn't need the address anymore. He had already arrived. He kept it anyway, the way you keep something when you're not ready to let go of the last step before the hard one. He knocked on the door. Nothing happened for long enough that he thought about knocking again. He raised his hand, and then the door opened. Michael Jensen looked at him through the screen door for a full 3 seconds without saying a word. He had aged. Of course he had. 12 years was 12 years, but it wasn't the aging that hit Gravel hardest. It was the stillness of him. Michael had always been a man in motion, a man whose hands were always doing something, whose eyes were always tracking the room alive with that particular kind of awareness that came from spending years reading situations before they became problems. That man was still in there somewhere. Gravel could see the structure of him. But whatever had been powering the lights inside Michael Jensen had been running on low for a very long time. "Ray," Michael said, not Gravel, Ray, the name he hadn't been called by anyone outside his mother in 15 years. "Michael," he said, "I know I don't have the right to be standing here." Michael looked past him at the bikes in the driveway, at the men standing by them, hats in hand, the way people stand outside hospitals or funerals when they don't know what to do with their bodies. Michael's expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes, a flash of something old and complicated, something that had never fully healed over. "Sarah called you," Michael said. "No." Gravel shook his head. "Sarah didn't call me. She came into the diner today and said her dad had a bike like ours, and she said your name, and..." He stopped. He started over. "I came because I should have come a long time ago. That's the only thing I know how to say right now." Michael looked at him. He looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, the screen door still between them, and Gravel held it. He didn't look away. He had rehearsed this about 40 times on the drive over, and every version of it had sounded wrong, and the one he had just said was no different, but it was the truth, and the truth was all he had brought with him. "You better come in," Michael said finally. He pushed the screen door open and stepped back. Gravel turned to the others. Dennis gave him a small nod. Gravel shook his head once, "Stay here," and turned back to the house and walked in alone. The door closed behind him. Dennis looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at the porch light. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They stood by their bikes in the cooling evening air, and they waited the way men wait when they know that whatever's happening inside a house is not theirs to witness. Inside, Gravel stood in the front hallway and took in what he could without letting himself study it too hard. A house that was clean but not warm. A house that had been lived in carefully the way a person lives when they are the only person they have to answer to, and they have forgotten what company feels like. There was a framed photo on the wall near the door, a woman with dark hair and Michael's daughter's eyes smiling at a camera. Not recent. The kind of photo that gets placed on a wall because you need it visible, but you can't look at it directly for too long. Michael had gone through to the kitchen. Gravel followed. "Coffee," Michael said. "Sure." Michael put the kettle on without looking at him. His movements were practiced and economical. The movements of a man who had done this 10,000 times alone. He got 2 mugs down from the cabinet, set them on the counter. Neither of them said anything for a minute, and the silence was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 men who had known each other in a previous lifetime, standing in the present, trying to find the thread. I heard about Linda, Gravel said, when it happened. I heard about it and you didn't come, Michael said, still not looking at him, still watching the kettle. No, Gravel said, I didn't come. Nobody came, Ray. He said it flat. No drama. Just the fact of it laid down like a stone. Not to the funeral, not after, not once. Gravel put his hands on the back of a kitchen chair and gripped it. I know. Do you? Michael turned around then. He looked at Gravel directly, and whatever had been banked down in those eyes was showing itself now, controlled, but present the way a fire is present when you've been keeping it low for a long time and someone opens the flue. Because I spent about 3 years trying to figure out what I had done, trying to understand what it was about me that made it so easy for all of you to just disappear. It wasn't about you, Gravel said. Then what was it about? The kettle started to hiss. Neither of them moved. It was about us being cowards, Gravel said. It was about a group of men who knew how to ride into a fight and didn't know how to sit with somebody's grief. He let go of the chair. That's the honest answer, Michael. We didn't know what to say, so we said nothing. And saying nothing was easier than... He stopped. There's no version of this that doesn't sound like an excuse. I know that. Michael stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the kettle and poured the water. Linda talked about you, you know, he said. His voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but different, more careful. Toward the end, she asked about the guys a few times. She thought you'd come. That hit Gravel somewhere specific, somewhere that didn't have a name but had an address. She thought there'd be people, Michael continued, people from before. She kept saying, when are the boys coming, Michael? And I kept telling her... He stopped. He poured the second cup. He pushed it across the counter toward Gravel without looking up. I told her you were all busy, that you had things going on, that you'd be by soon. The cup sat between them. You lied to her, Gravel said quietly. Yeah. Michael's jaw tightened. I lied to my wife on her deathbed so she wouldn't die, knowing that the men her husband called brothers had already walked away. He picked up his own cup. You're welcome. The words landed like a fist in Gravel's sternum. Not because they were cruel, Michael wasn't saying them to be cruel. He was saying them because they were true, and the truth didn't always sound gentle. Michael, I'm not looking for an apology, Ray. He looked up then, and his eyes were clear and hard and tired. I'm 61 years old. I buried my wife. I raised my daughter mostly on my own. I got through it. He took a drink of coffee. What I'm telling you is what it kept. That's different from asking you to fix it. Gravel picked up the cup. His hand was steady now, which felt wrong. Then why'd you let me in? He asked. Michael was quiet for a moment. Because Sarah gave you the address, he said finally. And if Sarah thought you were worth giving the address to, then maybe you had something worth saying. He set down his cup. She's a better judge of people than I am, always has been. No, something in Gravel's chest moved in a direction it hadn't moved in a long time. She's good, he said. She's really good, Michael. She's got your eyes and Linda's way of talking. She walks into a room and you feel like things are okay for a minute. Michael looked away. His hand came up and covered his mouth for a second, just a second, and then it came back down and he picked up his coffee cup again like nothing had happened. But Gravel had seen it. 12 years of working with men taught you what to look for, and what he had just seen was a man fighting very hard not to come apart. She's all I've got, Michael said. His voice was controlled. Just barely, but controlled. She's the only thing He stopped. She doesn't know, does she, about what happened, the real story. Gravel went still. What do you mean? Michael looked at him. The kind of look that meant don't play dumb. I mean about why you all left, he said. I mean about what happened before Linda got sick. The real reason the club went cold. He tilted his head slightly. You think she just found you by accident today? You think it was just luck that she walked up to your table and mentioned a bike? Gravel frowned. It was her table. You said, she's worked that diner for 3 years, Ray. Michael's voice had gone very quiet. 3 years. You've been coming in on Tuesdays for 11. The room felt different suddenly. The temperature hadn't changed, but something had. She knew who you were, Gravel said slowly. She figured it out about 8 months ago, Michael said. Found an old photo. The club back in 2003. She didn't say anything to me. She just waited. He looked at Gravel with something that might have been she and might have been something else. My daughter has been serving you coffee every Tuesday for 8 months, waiting for the right moment, trying to find a way to bridge something I'd sealed off without ever telling her why it needed to be sealed. Gravel set down the coffee cup. His mind was moving fast now, reassembling the afternoon in a completely different light. The casual mention of the bike, the way she had brought up the garage, the dust, the tarp, the way she had written the address down already on the back of a receipt like she'd prepared it. She hadn't just stumbled into it. She had planned it. She never said a word, Gravel said. That's my daughter. Michael's voice had something in it now, not quite pride, not quite sorrow, but the thing that lives between them. She doesn't make a big production of things. She just does what needs doing. Gravel thought about Sarah's face when he had looked at her across the table, the way she had stayed even and steady, the way she had said he doesn't have a lot of people left without making it sound like a plea. He had thought she was being kind. He had thought it was generous and instinctive the way some people are generous without trying. But it was something else. It was love. It was a daughter watching her father's lights go dim for 12 years and doing the only thing she could think of to try to turn them back on. She doesn't know what she walked into, Gravel said. She doesn't know the full story. No, Michael agreed. She doesn't. A pause. But you do. The kitchen went quiet. Gravel stood with his hands on the counter and his coffee going cold in front of him, and the full weight of what was happening settling down on him from somewhere above, pressing through his shoulders, down through the floor. Because what Michael had just said was true. Gravel knew the full story, all of it. The parts that weren't clean, the parts that didn't make the Hells Angels look like brothers, the parts that had no comfortable explanation and no easy apology attached. He knew what had happened in the spring of 2006, the specific chain of events that had led to Michael Jensen being left standing alone at his wife's graveside without a single member of his club in the church. And he had never told a soul, not because it was secret exactly, but because saying it out loud meant owning it completely, and owning it completely meant looking straight at the worst thing he had ever allowed to happen and calling it by its name. Michael, he said, there are things I need to say, things that are, he stopped, things that are going to make you angry. I'm already angry, Michael said quietly. I've been angry for 12 years. It doesn't get worse. It might, Michael looked at him. Say it anyway, he said. Outside the porch, light burned steady. Inside, 2 men stood on either side of a kitchen counter, and one of them was about to do the hardest thing he had ever done, which was not riding into a fight or facing down a threat, but simply opening his mouth and telling the truth about something he had kept quiet long enough to let it rot. Gravel took a breath. You remember a man named Cal Renner, he said. You remember what happened in March of 2006. Michael's expression didn't change, but his hand wrapped around the coffee cup tightened. Yeah, he said, I remember. Cal told us something before you left the club, Gravel said. He told us something about that night, about what really happened, and we believed him. All of us, me included, he stopped. And we were wrong to believe him. And by the time we found out we were wrong, Linda was already sick and we didn't, his voice roughened. We didn't know how to come back from it, so we didn't come at all. Michael was very still now. The kind of still that comes not from calm, but from a man pressing down on every impulse he has because he has decided to hear the whole thing before he reacts. What did Cal tell you, he asked. He told us you'd reported a member, Gravel said. To the police, he said you'd given information. He said that was why, Stop. Michael's voice was controlled, but there was a wire in it, now pulled tight. He told you I was an informant. Yes. The words sat in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. And you believed him, Michael said. We believed him, Gravel said. For 8 months we believed him. And then we found out from 3 different people that Cal had lied. That he had made it up because you had stood up to him in front of the whole club over something he did, and he wanted to destroy you for it. He looked at Michael. By the time we knew the truth, Linda had been diagnosed, and I kept telling myself I'd come when she was better. That I'd come when the timing was right. He stopped. She didn't get better. Michael set down his coffee cup. He turned away and stood with his back to Gravel, both hands on the counter looking at the wall. He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence was different from before. Before it had been the silence of old wounds. Now it was the silence of a wound being opened again, necessary and terrible, the kind of pain that comes with cleaning something out. My wife died thinking her husband's brothers abandoned him because grief made them uncomfortable. Michael said finally. His voice was low. She died not knowing what they really thought of him. Yes, Gravel said. And Cal Renner. He left the club in 2009. He's not around anymore. I don't care where he is. Michael turned back around. His face was controlled, but the anger was visible now. Not wild, not explosive, but deep and solid, the kind of anger that has been sitting in a foundation for years and doesn't need to shout because it has nowhere left to go. I lost 12 years, he said. I lost my wife's last years believing that every person who was supposed to be there had simply chosen not to be. I told her you were busy. I protected your reputation with my dying wife because I didn't want her to die knowing the truth, and the truth was that you all thought I was a rat. He stopped. His jaw worked. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Do you understand what I carried? Yes, Gravel said. I said. No, Michael said. You don't, not yet. He looked at Gravel hard. My daughter spent 8 months trying to reconnect me with men who thought her father was a traitor. She doesn't know that. She set this whole thing up out of love without knowing what she was walking into. He pointed toward the front of the house, toward the driveway where the bikes sat and the men waited. Those men out there, they came here tonight. Fine, they're here, but what are you going to do with the fact that Sarah did all of this in the dark? Gravel held his gaze. I'm going to tell her the truth, he said. The whole thing, everything. Michael stared at him. Everything, Gravel said again. Something shifted in Michael Jensen's face. Not forgiveness, it was too early for forgiveness, and both of them knew it. But something moved, a small, specific thing. The thing that moves in a man's face when he has been carrying something in total isolation for so long that he has forgotten other people are capable of weight bearing and someone proves him wrong. He pulled out a kitchen chair. He sat down. After a moment, Gravel pulled out the other one and sat down across from him. Start from the beginning, Michael said. Cal Renner, March of 2006. Tell me everything you know. And so Gravel did. He sat at Michael Jensen's kitchen table and he talked for the better part of an hour, and Michael listened without interrupting. And outside on the driveway, Dennis and Tommy and the others stood in the dark and said nothing, because they could feel through the walls and the silence that what was happening inside that house was the kind of thing that had to run its course. The porch light burned all night. Gravel talked for 54 minutes. He knew the exact time because Michael had a clock on the kitchen wall, one of those plain white ones with a black second hand that moves in clean ticks, and Gravel had watched it without meaning to, the way you watch something when the thing you're actually looking at is too heavy to hold straight. He started with Cal Renner in the night of March 14th, 2006, and he didn't leave anything out. He went through it the way you go through a wound, not carefully, not gently, just completely. Because the only thing worse than the full truth is the partial truth, and Michael Jensen had been living with a partial truth for 12 years, and that was already 12 years too long. Michael listened to all of it without moving. He sat with both arms on the table and his coffee gone cold beside him, and he listened to the story of how Cal Renner had stood up in front of the club and told them that Michael Jensen had walked into a police station in February of 2006 and given the name of a member who was under investigation. He listened to how Gravel had sat in that room and heard it and felt his stomach turn and wanted to push back but hadn't because Cal had detail, and detail was hard to argue with when you didn't have any of your own. He listened to how the club had gone cold on Michael quietly, the way ice forms not all at once but layer by layer, until one day the surface is solid and you can't see what's underneath anymore. When Gravel got to the part about finding out Cal had lied, Michael's eyes changed. Not dramatically, just a small specific shift, like a lens coming slightly into focus. Who told you? Michael asked. A man named Pete Garza, Gravel said. He'd left the club the year before. He came to me in the summer of 2006 and told me he'd been there the night Cal was talking about. He said there was no police station, no conversation, no report. He said Cal had invented the whole thing. Gravel stopped. And then 2 other guys confirmed it independently. People who had no reason to lie. Pete Garza, Michael repeated. He said it like he was pulling up a file. Stocky guy, had a scar on his chin. That's him? Michael nodded slowly. I always liked Pete, he said. And that was all he said about it. He didn't say thank God or I knew it or any of the things a man might say when he hears that someone has finally, after all this time, confirmed what he always knew about himself. He just sat with it, because that was the kind of man Michael Jensen was, the kind who didn't need the external validation to know his own truth, who had been carrying that truth alone for 12 years without cracking under it, and who was not going to perform relief for anybody's benefit now that it had finally been returned to him. What he said instead was, "So why didn't you come?" Gravel put both hands flat on the table. "Because Linda was already sick by the time we knew," he said. "And I told myself the timing was wrong. I told myself it would upset her having us show up after everything. I told myself Michael would reach out when he was ready." He paused. "I told myself a lot of things, and every single one of them was a version of cowardice dressed up to look like consideration." Michael looked at him for a long time. "You know what the worst part is," he said. "The worst part isn't that you believe Cal. Men believe things. People lie, and people get fooled, and that's how it goes." He shifted in his chair. "The worst part is that even if it had been true, even if I had actually walked into that station and done what he said, Linda was dying. She was dying, Ray, and you all still didn't come." That landed differently than anything else Gravel had said or heard that evening, because it was true, and it was a truth that existed entirely apart from Cal Renner and the light and the revelation. It was its own separate indictment, the kind that doesn't care about explanation or context, that just sits in the room and waits to be acknowledged. Gravel opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded. "You're right," he said. "That one doesn't have an excuse. There's no version of that one where we come out okay." Michael nodded once like a judge marking something in a ledger. "No," he said. "There isn't." The clock ticked. The night pressed in around the house. Outside, Gravel could hear the faint sound of the men shifting one of the bike seats, creaking. Dennis probably, who could never stand still for long. They had been out there for over an hour. They hadn't left. "The men outside," Michael said, like he'd heard the same sound. "They know all of this." "Everything I know," Gravel said. "We talked about it on the road a while back. Tommy had figured out part of it on his own. Dennis had been saying for years we needed to come. I was the one who kept putting it off." He stopped. "That's on me. The delay is on me." "Why you?" Michael asked. Simple. Direct. "Why you specifically?" It was the question Gravel had least wanted to answer and most expected to be asked. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the cold coffee cup. He looked at the clock. And then he looked at Michael and he told the truth, which was the only currency left between them. "Because I was the one who stood up in that room when Cal made the accusation and I didn't say a word." He held eye contact. "I didn't believe it completely, not even then. But I was angry at you about something else, something small and stupid, something that had nothing to do with any of it, and I let that anger make the decision for me. I let it make me quiet when I should have been loud." He stopped. Every day that went by after that, the silence got heavier. And the heavier it got, the harder it was to break. You know how that works. Michael was quiet. "Yeah," he said finally. "I know how that works." He stood up. He picked up the 2 cold coffee cups and carried them to the sink. He stood there for a moment with his back to Gravel, not moving, just standing. And then he turned the faucet on and rinsed them out, and the sound of the water was the loudest thing in the room. "There's a box in the garage," Michael said, his back still turned. "Linda's things. Things from before she got sick. There are photographs in it, the club, 2004 and 2005. Good years." He turned the water off. "I never threw them out. I could have. I thought about it plenty." He turned around and leaned against the sink. "I didn't because Linda would have hated it. She believed in people. She believed in you people even when she had no reason left to." He looked at Gravel. "I kept the box for her." Gravel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "The bike's in the garage too," Michael said. "Sarah told me." "She tell you I haven't touched it?" "She said it was under a tarp." Michael nodded. "I was going to sell it after Linda. I had somebody interested. Good price." He crossed his arms. "I couldn't do it. Couldn't make myself sign the paperwork." He paused. That probably sounds pathetic. It doesn't, Gravel said. I used to think it was grief, Michael said, holding on to things. The bike, the box, the house, keeping everything exactly the way it was. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. But it wasn't grief, it was, I don't know what you'd call it, stubbornness maybe. Some part of me that refused to believe the story was actually over. He stopped. Stupid. Not stupid, Gravel said. Accurate. Michael looked at him. The story's not over, Gravel said. That's what I came here to say. That's the thing I should have come here to say 10 years ago. The kitchen held that for a moment. Michael uncrossed his arms and stood with his hands at his sides, and for the first time since Gravel had walked in, he looked less like a man bracing for impact and more like a man who was uncertain what to do when the thing he had been bracing for didn't arrive. That was when they heard the knock at the door. Not the front door, the side door, the one that opened from the garage into the kitchen. Both men turned. The knock came again, two short, then one. Gravel didn't know what that meant. Michael did. His whole expression changed. Sarah, he said. He crossed to the door and opened it. Sarah Jensen was standing in the doorway with her jacket still on and her car keys in her hand, which meant she had driven straight from somewhere without stopping. Her eyes went from her father to Gravel and back to her father, and Gravel could see the moment she registered that the conversation she had engineered had actually happened, that these two men had been sitting in this kitchen together for the better part of an hour, and that whatever had passed between them had left its mark on both their faces. I was going to stay away, she said. I told myself all evening I was going to stay away and let it be. She looked at her father. I couldn't do it. I know, Michael said. He stepped back to let her in. She came through the door and stopped in the middle of the kitchen, and her eyes went to Gravel again, and this time they weren't the steady, professionally neutral eyes of a waitress who'd been managing a careful plan for 8 months. They were the eyes of a daughter who had done something enormous in the dark and was only now standing in the light of it, feeling the full size of what she'd moved. He told you, she said to Gravel. Not a question. About the 8 months, Gravel said. Yeah. She looked at her father. Are you angry? No, Michael said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised her. Gravel could see. It surprised her the small flinch of relief she tried to keep off her face. Dad, I found the photo a long time ago. I recognized the bikes. I recognized... Sarah, his voice was quiet. I know, it's all right. I just wanted... She stopped. She looked like she was trying to decide how to say the next thing without it sounding like what it was, which was a plea. You were getting so settled into it. The aloneness, like you'd decided it was just going to be that way forever, and I couldn't... She stopped again. You were trying to fix something, Michael said. I was trying to fix something, she agreed, without asking me. If I'd asked you, you would have said no. Michael looked at her. Something moved in his face that Gravel recognized from the earlier part of the conversation, that same motion of something shifting underground, something that had been fixed for a long time, discovering it had a little give left in it. Yeah, Michael said. I probably would have. Sarah looked at Gravel. Did you tell him everything? Everything I know, Gravel said. Something in Sarah's face shifted. What does that mean, everything you know? Gravel looked at Michael. Michael gave him a small nod, the kind that means go ahead. Your father was pushed out of the club based on a lie, Gravel said. A man named Cal Renner told us your father had gone to the police. It wasn't true. By the time we found out it wasn't true, your mother was already sick. We didn't come. That's the short version. Sarah stared at him. She turned to her father. You knew this? You knew it was a lie. I knew what I'd done and what I hadn't done, Michael said simply. I didn't need them to confirm it. But you never told me. There was nothing to tell that would have helped you, he said. What was I going to say? The men who disappeared thought I was a rat, but I wasn't. What does that do for you? It explains everything, Sarah said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. She pulled it back fast the way her father did. Gravel could see the exact same mechanism in both of them. Dad, I spent 3 years watching you, and I didn't know why. I didn't know what I was trying to fix. I just knew something had broken, and nobody was talking about it. Michael crossed to her and put his hand on her shoulder, just briefly, the way men of his generation do, when what they mean is, I love you and I'm sorry, And you did good all at once, compressed into a single gesture because the words feel too large to say standing up in a kitchen. You fixed it, he said quietly. You brought him here. Whatever happens next, you did that. Sarah put her hand over his for 1 second. Then she stepped back and looked at Gravel with eyes that were dry and direct and very much her father's. What happened to Cal Renner? She asked. Gravel paused. He left the club in 2009, he said. Last I heard, he was in Phoenix. That's it. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it. He destroyed my father's life, and he just left. Sarah, Michael said. No, I want to know. She looked at Gravel. Did anyone ever confront him? Did anyone ever go to him and say you lied, and this is what it cost? Gravel held her gaze. No, he said. Why not? It was the same question Michael had asked in a different form, and the answer was the same, and Gravel gave it the same way plainly without softening it. Because we were ashamed, and he said, and shame makes people go quiet instead of going forward. We knew what we'd done. We knew what believing that lie had cost your father, and we didn't know how to face it, so we didn't. He stopped. I'm not defending it. I'm telling you the truth. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for 8 months across a diner counter. Except now there was no pretense between them, no careful performance of ordinary conversation. Just a young woman looking at an older man who had failed her family and come here anyway, which was not enough but was something. Okay, she said finally. Okay. She pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. Michael sat back down too, and Gravel looked at these two people, this quiet, weathered man and his daughter, who had moved mountains without telling anyone, and he felt the particular weight of being in the presence of people who were better than the situation they had been handed. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the kind of feeling that requires something of you. It requires you to rise toward it or confess that you can't. He sat back down. There's something else, Gravel said. Both of them looked at him. He had not planned to say this tonight. He had planned to get through the basics, make the apology, leave the door open, give it time. That was the plan. But sitting at this table with these two people and 12 years of silence in the room with them, the plan felt dishonest, like wearing a partial truth and calling it enough. The night Cal made the accusation, Gravel said, there were 3 men in that room who had been at the same location as Michael on the night in question. 3 men who could have stood up and said, we were there, this is what happened. Cal's account doesn't match. 3 men who stayed quiet. Michael's eyes sharpened. 3 men, he said. Yes. You were one of them. Yes. Who were the other 2? Gravel's jaw tightened. He had known this question was coming. He had known it from the moment he decided to tell the whole truth, because the whole truth had names in it, and names had consequences. And some of those consequences were standing in the driveway right now. Dennis Marsh, he said, and Tommy Ricks. The kitchen went very still. Sarah looked at her father. Michael's face had gone hard. Not angry, not yet, but the way a face goes hard when it is processing something that changes the shape of what came before. Dennis and Tommy were not abstractions. They were men Sarah knew by their orders. Men who had been sitting in that corner booth for 11 years. Men who had walked into this driveway tonight and stood in the dark while Gravel spoke for all of them. They had been in the room. They had said nothing. For 12 years they had said nothing, ridden with the Gravel, eaten burgers and BLTs, and let a lie stand that they had the power to correct. Michael stood up from the table. He didn't say anything. He walked to the side door, the one that led through the garage, and he opened it and kept walking. Gravel heard the garage door engage, heard the creak of it rolling up, heard footsteps on concrete. He looked at Sarah. Sarah was already on her feet. They both followed. Michael walked through the garage without stopping, past the box of Linda's things, and past the tarp-covered shape that had been a motorcycle for 12 years, and he opened the door at the far end that led out to the driveway. The night air came in. The men outside turned. Dennis Marsh straightened up immediately when he saw Michael's face. He was a big man, bigger than Michael Broder, the kind of physical presence that took up a room without effort. But standing in that driveway looking at Michael Jensen for the first time in 12 years, Dennis Marsh looked small. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told that he was going to have to put it down right here, right now, in front of everyone. Michael, Dennis said. You were there, Michael said. No preamble, no warm-up. Straight through to it, the way Michael Jensen apparently did everything. March of 2006, you were in the room. Dennis looked at Gravel, who had come through the garage behind Michael. I told him, Gravel said. Dennis looked back at Michael. His jaw worked. He nodded. Yes, he said, I was there. And you didn't say anything. No. Why? It was the same question asked for the third time tonight to the third man who deserved it. And Dennis Marsh, who had ridden through 30 years of hard situations without flinching, had to look away before he could answer. Because Cal was scary, he said, and you were always the one who stood up to him, and we all let you take that role for so long that when he turned it back on, none of us knew how to take it from you. He stopped. He looked back at Michael. That's a pathetic answer. Yeah, Michael said, it is. Tommy Ricks had come around from the other side of the bikes. He was shorter than Dennis, quieter, the missing fingers on his left hand wrapped around his hat brim. He looked at Michael with an expression that had given up on trying to be anything other than what it was, which was guilt that had aged into something permanent. I should have spoken, Tommy said. He didn't wait to be addressed. I've known that since the day I didn't. I've known it every single day since. He stopped. There's nothing I can say that makes that all right. No, Michael said, there isn't. The four of them stood there, Michael, Gravel, Dennis, Tommy, and the weight of it all was physical, the way certain silences become physical, pressing on the chest, making the air feel thicker. Sarah was standing in the garage doorway. She had one hand on the door frame, and she was watching her father with the focused, careful attention of someone who is witnessing something important and knows it and is not going to look away. Michael looked at his old brothers at Gravel, who had just spent an hour telling him everything at Dennis, who had looked away before he could answer at Tommy, who had answered before he was asked. He looked at the others standing further back, three men who had been younger in 2006, who carried their own portions of the weight. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was not soft and it was not warm. But it was steady, and in a man like Michael Jensen, steadiness was its own kind of extraordinary. Linda would have wanted me to hear you out, he said. So I'm going to hear you out. All of you. He looked around at each face. But not tonight. Tonight I need you to leave. Nobody argued. Nobody offered a counter. Gravel nodded once and turned toward his bike. Dennis moved. Tommy moved. The others fell in line without a word. Michael watched them get ready to go. Then he said, without raising his voice, Gravel. Gravel turned. The thing you said earlier, Michael said, when you're ready, we'll ride with you. He paused. You meant that? Every word Gravel said? Michael looked at him for a moment. Come back Saturday, he said. All of you. Come at noon. We'll talk. Another pause. That's not a promise of anything. That's just come back. We'll be here, Gravel said. Michael turned and walked back into the garage without another word. The door stayed open behind him. Sarah stayed in the doorway watching the bikes as they started up one by one, the sound of them filling the driveway, rolling back toward the street. She watched until the last taillight disappeared around the bend at the end of Hartley Road. Then she turned back into the garage. Her father was standing beside the tarp-covered bike with one hand resting on it, not moving, not pulling the tarp back, just touching it. The way you touch something you're not sure yet whether you're ready to uncover. She didn't say anything. She walked over and stood beside him. She put her hand next to his on the tarp. They stood there together in the quiet of the garage, father and daughter with 12 years of untold story, finally out in the open air and a bike beneath their hands that had been waiting longer than either of them knew exactly what for. The porch light was still burning. Saturday came the way difficult things always come, too fast and not fast enough at the same time. Michael Jensen was up before 6. He hadn't slept past 5:30 in 12 years, not since the last months of Linda's illness, when sleeping felt like abandonment, like leaving her alone in the dark even when he was right there in the same room. The habit had stayed. Sleep was something that happened to him in a narrow window between exhaustion and the alarm in his head that said, that's enough. Get up, stay useful. It was not restful, but it was his, and he had stopped fighting it a long time ago. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it. He thought about Saturday. He had said, come back Saturday, without fully thinking about what Saturday would mean. He had said it the way a man says something when he is managing the end of a situation that has used up most of his emotional reserves, and he needs it to be over for the night. He had meant it, but meaning it at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, with Gravel's taillights disappearing around the end of the road, was a different thing from meaning it at 5:45 on a Saturday morning, with 4 days of thinking behind him and 6 men on their way. 4 days of thinking. He had gone through it the way he went through most things alone, systematically, without drama. He had taken the story Gravel had given him and he had laid it out in his mind like a map, going over each part, each decision point, each place where someone had chosen silence over truth. He had done this not because he was looking for reasons to stay angry, but because he needed to understand the shape of what had happened before he could decide what to do with it. Michael Jensen had always been a man who needed to understand the shape of a thing. It was one of the qualities that had made him useful to the club back when he had a club. It was one of the qualities that had made him a good husband back when he had a wife. He understood the shape of this. He didn't like it. Understanding a thing and accepting a thing were different operations, and he had never confused them. But he understood it. He understood that Cal Renner had been a particular kind of man, the kind who knew exactly which blade to use for which wound, and that he had used the club's own codes against them, had made Michael's greatest strength, his willingness to stand up, look like his greatest betrayal. Michael understood how that worked. He had seen it work on other men. He had just never thought he would be the man it worked on. He also understood, and this was the harder part, that the men who had believed Cal's lie were not entirely different from men he had called brothers for 15 years. They were the same men. They had the same failings they had always had. He had known those failings going in, and he had loved them anyway for all the good things that coexisted with the failings. And that love didn't disappear just because the failings had finally cost him something real. That didn't make it okay. He had been clear with himself about that. It was not okay. It would never be okay in the clean, simple way that some people needed things to be okay. But it was survivable. It was workable. It was something that two men could sit across a table from and decide together what, if anything, came next. That was what Saturday was for. He finished his coffee. He went to the garage. He stood for a moment in the middle of the space between the box of Linda's things and the tarp-covered bike, and he made a decision he had been circling for 4 days. He gripped the edge of the tarp and he pulled it off in one motion, the way you take a bandage fast, committed, no pausing halfway. The bike sat in the morning air. It was dusty. It needed work. He could see that immediately, the professional assessment happening. Automatically, the way a language you've spoken your whole life never entirely leaves you, even when you stop using it. The chrome had oxidized in places. The tires were flat. The seat leather had dried and cracked along one edge. But the frame was sound. The structure was intact. Whatever time had taken from the surface, it hadn't touched the bones. Michael put his hand on the handlebar. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back inside, finished getting dressed, and called Sarah. She answered on the first ring. "You're already awake," she said, not surprised. "Come over before they get here," he said. "I want to talk to you first." A pause. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I just want to see you before it gets complicated." She was there by 8:30. She came in through the front door and went straight to the kitchen the way she always did, shrugging out of her jacket and moving to the coffee maker without being asked. And Michael sat at the table and watched her and felt the particular kind of love that has no adequate name, the love for a child who has grown into someone who surprises you, who turned out to be more than you, had the capacity to imagine when you were standing in a hospital room holding them for the first time. "I pulled the tarp off the bike," he said. Sarah turned around with 2 coffee cups in her hands. She set them down carefully. "Okay. It needs work. Probably a week's worth if I go at it steady, maybe less." She sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him. "Dad, I'm not saying anything yet," he said. "I'm just telling you what I saw." "Okay." She nodded. "Okay, that's good." He looked at his coffee. "You want to tell me why you really did it?" "The 8 months, the plan. I know what you told me Tuesday night, but I'm asking for the full version." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The version she gave him was not what she had given Gravel. This one was for her father, which meant it was more honest. "There was a night about a year ago," she said. "You had come over for dinner, a Sunday, And we ate and we watched TV for a while. And when you left, I walked you to your car and you said, "Do you remember what you said?" He shook his head. "You said, 'I'll see you next Sunday, I suppose.'" She looked at him. "Not next Sunday. Next Sunday, I suppose." Like it was something you were enduring. Like time was just something to get through. She stopped. "I stood in the driveway and watched you drive away, and I thought he's disappearing. He's been disappearing for years, and I've been watching it happen, and I haven't done anything." Michael looked at his hands. "I wasn't disappearing," he said. "Dad." "Sarah." "You had stopped making plans," she said. "You had stopped fixing things around the house. The porch railing has been loose for 3 years, and you used to be the man who fixed things before they were broken." She kept her voice even, not accusing, just stating. "You were maintaining. You were doing exactly enough to get through each day and no more. And I know grief. I know what it looks like. I watched it take Mom, and I watched it take pieces of you at the same time, but this was different." She paused. This felt like someone who had decided the best part of the story was over. Michael was quiet. He picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking. "Maybe it was," he said. "It wasn't," Sarah said immediately. "It isn't." She leaned forward. "Dad, you are 61 years old. That's not old. That's not the end. That's a man with a bike in his garage and history with people who are not dead and years ahead of him if he decides to use them." She stopped. "I know I went behind your back. I know I should have talked to you first, but I knew what you'd say." "You would have said no," he agreed. "And you would have been wrong," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like your mother," he said. Something moved in Sarah's face, a quick brightness that came and went like light through a gap in something. "Good," she said. "Then listen to me." He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. They drank their coffee. They talked about the bike, the specific work it needed, where he would source the parts. They talked about Linda, which they did not often do directly, but which felt possible this morning in a way that it didn't always. Sarah told him that she had found a photograph when she'd been going through her own things. A birthday party, Michael and Linda and Sarah at maybe 7 years old, and in the background, almost out of frame, 2 motorcycles parked at the curb. "I didn't even know that was your world," Sarah said. "Not until I saw the photo and recognized the bikes." "I kept it separate," Michael said. "Your mother knew everything, but I tried to keep those 2 worlds from overlapping too much. The riding world and the home world." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I was proud of what we were building here. The house, the family. I didn't want it contaminated by things that were complicated." He stopped. "In the end, the complicated things found their way in anyway." "They always do," Sarah said. He nodded. "They always do." Noon arrived. Michael heard them before he saw them, the low rumble coming up the road, not roaring, keeping it quiet, respectful, the way you ride when you're arriving somewhere that calls for a certain register. He heard the engines cut. He heard boots on the driveway. He did not move from the kitchen table immediately. He let them knock. Gravel knocked twice, waited, knocked once more. Michael opened the door. 6 men on the porch. Gravel at the front, Dennis behind him to the left, Tommy to the right, the others arranged behind them. They were not in their riding gear. They were in regular clothes, jeans and flannel and boots. Yes, but no cuts, no leather with patches. Michael noticed that immediately and understood it immediately. They had chosen not to come as the club. They had come as the men underneath the club, which was the more difficult thing to be. "Come in," Michael said. They filed through into the living room, which was not large enough for 7 men, but managed it. Sarah was in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching. Gravel saw her and nodded. She nodded back. The small acknowledgement of 2 people who had been working toward the same thing from different directions. Michael stood in the middle of his living room with 6 men who had shaped 15 years of his life, and he looked at them and he let the silence sit for one moment before he spoke. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond," he said. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Gravel said. The others nodded. "I've had 4 days to think about what you told me Tuesday," Michael said. 4 days to go through it. The silence, all of it, daw. He looked at Dennis. Dennis held his gaze. "I want you to know that I understand on some level how it happened. Cal was convincing. The timing was bad. Shame is a complicated thing. I understand the mechanics of it." He paused. Understanding it doesn't mean I'm all right with it. I want to be clear about that. What happened cost me things that can't be returned. Linda died without knowing her husband's reputation was clean. I spent 12 years in a kind of solitary confinement that nobody sentenced me to out loud, but I was in it just the same. His voice was controlled and even, and it cost him something to keep it that way, but he kept it. Those are real losses. They happened. I'm not going to stand here and tell you they didn't. Nobody spoke. But I'm also 61 years old, he said, and I have been keeping this house like a museum for 12 years. And my daughter, he glanced at Sarah, my daughter apparently spent 8 months of her life quietly building a bridge that I would have refused to walk onto if she'd asked me first. So, he stopped. He put his hands in his pockets. I'm willing to have a conversation. I'm not promising anything beyond that. I'm saying I'm willing to be in the room. Gravel stepped forward. That's more than we deserve, he said. Yeah, Michael said. It is. Dennis made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, something in between, and he put his hand over his mouth for a second. Michael, he said. He stopped. Tried again. The night Cal made that accusation, I have thought about that night every week for 12 years. Every week without exception. Good, Michael said. Not cruelly, just honestly. I want to tell you why I didn't speak, Dennis said. Not to excuse it, just because you deserve the real reason. Then tell me the real reason. Dennis looked at the floor for a moment, and he was a big man and the bigness worked against him right now because there was nowhere for him to put his discomfort. It was too visible on him, too large, no way to make it smaller. I owed Cal money, he said. Not a lot, but I owed it. And when he stood up and started talking, my first thought wasn't whether it was true. My first thought was about the money and what Cal would do if I publicly went against him. He looked back up. That's the real reason. A debt. You lost 12 years because I was afraid of a debt. The room went very still. Michael stared at him. Something moved across Michael's face that nobody in the room could entirely read, a complex layered thing, moving through several stages too quickly to name. His jaw tightened. His eyes went hard and then went somewhere else for a moment, somewhere internal, and then came back. How much? He said. Dennis blinked. What? The debt. How much? Michael, that's not. How much, Dennis? Dennis looked stunned. $400. The number landed in the room and just stayed there, sitting on all of them. $400, 12 years, a dead-end road in a museum house, and a daughter building secret bridges, and a wife who died believing her husband had been abandoned because grief was inconvenient. $400. Sarah made a small sound from the kitchen doorway. She stopped it fast, but it was there. Michael nodded slowly like a man doing math in his head. Okay, he said. His voice was very quiet. Okay. Tommy Ricks said, I didn't have a reason like that. I just want to put that on record. I didn't owe Cal anything. I was just afraid of him, and I let it make me small. He looked at Michael directly. I've got no excuse better than cowardice. I know that. At least it's clean, Michael said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't quite bitter and wasn't quite dark, but was in that neighborhood a weariness that went down to the bone. Gravel watched Michael's face and made a decision. There's one more thing, he said. Michael looked at him. Of course there is. Cal Renner, Gravel said. He's still in Phoenix. I've been in contact with him. I reached out 3 days ago. He stopped. I told him I was coming to see you. I told him I was going to tell you everything. And I told him that if he wanted to have any kind of conscience left by the end of this, he needed to do something. The room shifted. Michael went very still. You contacted Cal Renner, he said. Yes. Before you came here Saturday? Yes. What did he say? Gravel reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to Michael. He said this. Michael looked at the envelope. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it the way he had looked at everything this week, measuring it, deciding whether he was ready. What's in it? Sarah said. She had moved from the doorway without anyone noticing, and she was standing beside her father now, close enough that their arms were touching. A letter, Gravel said. He wrote it by hand. I haven't read it. He sealed it himself and gave it to me 2 days ago when I drove to Phoenix. He paused. I drove to Phoenix and back in one day to get it before Saturday. I wanted you to have it today, not later. Michael looked at Gravel. You drove to Phoenix, he said. There and back. 14 hours on the road. Closer to 16 with traffic, Gravel said. I wanted to make sure it got here. Something in Michael's expression shifted so fully and completely that even the men who had known him for 15 years weren't prepared for it. The hardness didn't leave. The hardness never fully left. Michael Jensen's face, it was structural, it was load-bearing, but something else came into it. Something that made him look just briefly like the man he had been before all of this. Before Cal Renner and the silence, in the 12 years. He took the envelope, he looked at it. His name was on the front, in handwriting, and he did not recognize, which made sense. He had never seen Cal Renner's handwriting before. He turned it over, sealed shut, as promised. I'll read it later, he said. Of course, Gravel said. Michael set the envelope on the side table beside him. He looked around at the 6 men in his living room. Men who had driven long roads and kept their cuts at home and stood on his porch without knowing for certain whether he was going to open the door. Men who had failed him in a specific and irreversible way and who were here anyway, which was not the same as making it right, but was a real thing in its own category. Are you hungry? He said. The question surprised everyone in the room, including Sarah. Dennis blinked. What? Are you hungry? Michael said again. It's noon. I have food. I wasn't planning to feed anyone, but I have food. He looked at Sarah. You could make something work. Sarah stared at her father for a beat. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Yeah, she said. I can make something work. She turned and went to the kitchen. Michael looked back at the men. Sit down, he said. Not on the couch, it's older than some of you, and I'd like it to survive the afternoon. There are chairs. Dennis let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since Tuesday. He moved to a chair. Tommy moved to another. The others found places. Gravel stayed standing for a moment, looking at Michael with an expression that had several things in it, gratitude being one of them, but not the loudest. Michael, he said quietly. Don't make a thing of it, Michael said. I'm feeding you lunch, that's all it is. Yeah, Gravel said. Okay. He sat down. From the kitchen came the sound of Sarah moving the refrigerator, opening, something hitting a pan, the ordinary comforting sounds of a house that was functioning like a house again. Michael sat in his chair and looked at the men in his living room, men he had known and lost and was not yet ready to say he had found again, but who were here in his house on a Saturday at noon, which was more than he had been able to say for 12 years. He picked up the envelope from the side table. He turned it over in his hands once. He set it back down. Not yet, but soon. He knew himself well enough to know that he would read it tonight alone, when the house was quiet and the porch light was burning and there was no one to see his face when the words landed. Whatever Cal Renner had written, whatever shape the apology took or didn't take, he would face it the same way he had faced everything since Linda. In the dark upright without flinching. But right now, there were men in his living room and his daughter was in his kitchen, and the smell of something cooking was moving through the house for the first time in longer than he wanted to calculate. Gravel was saying something to Dennis. Tommy was looking at a photograph on the wall, not Linda's, a different one, an older one, the kind that lives in a house so long it becomes part of the architecture. One of the younger men was asking Sarah something through the kitchen doorway, and Sarah was answering him over her shoulder with the easy competence of a woman who had been managing difficult men across countertops for 3 years and found it required very little of her anymore. Michael watched all of it, and somewhere in his chest, in a room that had been locked and wallpapered over for 12 years, something shifted. Not a door opening, not yet, but the sound a door makes before it opens, a small mechanical click deep in the mechanism, the sound of something deciding it was ready to move. He let it sit there without naming it. Some things you couldn't rush. Some things had to find their own timing. He had learned that from Linda, who had known it instinctively, who had said once, and he remembered it exactly the way he remembered everything she had said. The last year, Michael, you can't force a thing into being ready. You just have to stay close to it. He had stayed close to it. For 12 years, in one way or another, he had stayed close to all of it. The bike, the house, the porch light, the box of photographs. He had stayed close. And now Saturday had arrived and 6 men were sitting in his living room, and his daughter was making lunch, and the envelope was on the side table with his name on the front in a stranger's handwriting, and the door was considering whether it was ready. He thought it might be. He thought for the first time in a very long time that it might actually be. Cal Renner's letter was 4 pages long. Michael read it at 11:17 on Saturday night after everyone had gone home and the house had settled back into its particular silence. He had waited until he heard Sarah's car pull out of the driveway, waited until the last engine sound faded off. Hartley Road waited until there was nothing left in the house but the tick of the kitchen clock and the faint creak of the structure around him, the sounds a house makes when it is holding itself together in the dark. He opened the envelope at the kitchen table with a glass of water he didn't touch. Cal Renner had not hired a lawyer to write the letter. He had not used careful language or measured sentences designed to limit liability. The handwriting was uneven in places, pressing too hard in some lines and going light in others, the way handwriting goes when the person holding the pen is not entirely in control of their own hands. It was the handwriting of a man who had been sitting with something for a long time and was finally under pressure putting it down on paper, not because it was comfortable, but because there was no longer a version of himself he could live with that didn't do it. He wrote that he had lied, directly in the second sentence without preamble. I told the club you had gone to the police and it was not true. I invented it. I had the details ready because I had been building the story for 2 weeks before I said it, waiting for the right moment, waiting for a room full of people who would believe me over you. He wrote why. That was the part Michael had not expected, not the admission which Gravel had already delivered, but the reason. Cal wrote that Michael had stood up to him in front of the club over something Cal had done to a woman who was not in the club, not connected to anything, just a woman who had made the mistake of getting close to Cal at the wrong time. Michael had found out. Michael had said something directly and publicly the way Michael Jensen did everything. No maneuvering, no politics, just this is what happened. And this is wrong, said in a room full of men who respected him enough to listen. Cal wrote, you were the only one who ever made me feel like what I was. Everyone else either didn't know or didn't say it. You said it. And I could not live inside that club with you knowing it, and I could not make you leave, so I made them throw you out. Michael read that line 3 times, not because he didn't understand it the first time. He understood it perfectly the first time. He read it 3 times because there is a difference between understanding the shape of something and actually standing inside it, and the second and third readings were about standing inside it, about feeling the full dimensions of what had been done to him and why and by whom. He set down the letter. He picked up the glass of water and drank all of it. He set the glass down. He picked the letter back up. The last page was the hardest. He could tell Cal had known it was the hardest because the handwriting on that page was the most uneven of all the pressure behind the pen, the most inconsistent. Cal wrote about Linda. He wrote that he had heard she was sick roughly 6 months after the accusation, and that he had told himself it had nothing to do with him, that Michael's marriage and Michael's grief were separate from what Cal had done inside the club, that the 2 things were not connected. He wrote, I kept telling myself that for 15 years, and I never believed it for one day. He wrote that he was not asking for forgiveness. He was explicit about that, and Michael respected him for it, the only thing in the letter that deserved respect, but it was there. He wrote that he knew forgiveness was not something he was owed, and that asking for it would be another way of making Michael carry something for Cal's benefit. He said he was writing the letter because Gravel had driven 16 hours round trip and sat in front of him and said Michael Jensen deserves the truth from the source, and there had been no version of that conversation Cal could end and still be the person he occasionally tried to tell himself he was. He signed it with his full name, Calvin Richard Renner. No abbreviation. The whole thing laid out, nothing hidden. Michael folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He held the envelope in his hands for a moment. Then he got up from the table and walked through the house to the garage and stood in front of the bike and stayed there for a long time without moving. He was not crying. He needed to say that to himself clearly because what was happening in his chest was large enough that it might have been mistaken for something that came out of the eyes, but it wasn't that. It was something older and more fundamental, the particular physical sensation of a pressure system that has been building for 12 years, beginning slowly and irreversibly to move. He put his hand on the handlebar. All right, Linda, he said out loud. His voice was steady. Let's see what this looks like. He did not sleep that night. He worked. He worked from midnight until the sun came up, and he worked with the focused, systematic attention of a man who had spent 12 years doing maintenance on everything except the thing that mattered. He found the tools he needed without looking for them. Muscle memory is a form of loyalty, and his hands had not forgotten any of it. He worked through the flat tires and the oxidized chrome and the cracked seat leather, cataloging what needed immediate attention and what could wait, building the list in his head with the efficiency of long practice. By 6 in the morning, he had done 4 hours of work and had a clear picture of what the rest required. He sat on the garage floor beside the bike with a cup of cold coffee he'd brought from the kitchen, and he looked at what 12 years had done and what one night had begun to undo, and he let himself feel something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like himself, not entirely, not the full, undiminished version that man had taken some permanent losses and wouldn't be coming back in his original form, and Michael Jensen was not the kind of man who confused restoration with resurrection. But the version that was sitting on a concrete floor at 6 in the morning, with grease on his hands and a to-do list forming in his mind, and something pressing upward in his chest, that version was recognizably him. The bones of him, the structure that Linda had loved and his daughter had been trying to find for 3 years. He called Sarah at 7. She answered in 2 rings and said immediately, "Did you read it? Last night?" "And come over," he said. "I'm in the garage." She arrived in 20 minutes, which meant she had been awake. She came through the side door and stopped when she saw the bike, the tarp in the corner, the tools out, her father on a stool with a rag in his hand, and the particular quality of alertness in his eyes that she had not seen in so long she had to recalibrate her memory to place it. "Dad," she said, and then she couldn't say anything else for a moment. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Sit down. I want to tell you about the letter." She sat on the workbench across from him. He told her. All of it, Cal's reason the woman Michael had defended the 15 years of Cal's self-justification, the last page about Linda. He told it the way he had processed it, plainly and directly, and Sarah listened the way she always listened, without interruption, without visible reaction, until she had the whole thing, banking everything until she had the shape of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The woman he hurt," Sarah said. "Did she know? Did she ever know that someone stood up for her?" Michael looked at her. The question had not occurred to him, and the fact that it had occurred to Sarah within 30 seconds of hearing the story told him something about who his daughter was that he already knew, but never got tired of confirming. "I don't know," he said. "I think you should find out," she said. "If she's findable, I think she should know." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "you're right." "And the letter," Sarah said. "What are you going to do with it?" He looked down at the rag in his hands. "Keep it," he said. "Not because I need it, but because Linda didn't get to see it, and keeping it is the closest thing I can do to having her know." He stopped. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't," Aribor said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely. "It sounds like you." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at someone you have known their entire life and are still, after all these years, surprised by. "Your mother would have liked who you turned out to be," he said. Sarah pressed her lips together. She nodded once fast, and then she looked at the bike. "Okay," she said, the way she always redirected when something got too large for the room. "What does it need? Walk me through it." He walked her through it. They talked parts and timing and what could be sourced locally versus what he'd have to order. And the conversation was practical and grounded, and exactly the kind of conversation Michael Jensen needed after a night of letters and reckoning something to do with his hands and his mind, something forward-facing, something that was about what came next rather than what had already passed. He called Gravel at 9. Gravel answered on the 3rd ring, the way he always did. "Michael." "I read the letter," Michael said, a pause. "Okay. You drove to Phoenix and back in one day to get it." "I did." "Why didn't you tell me that before you handed it to me?" "Because it wasn't about me," Gravel said. "I didn't want you thinking about the drive. I wanted you thinking about the letter." Michael was quiet for a moment. "The woman," he said, "the one Cal hurt, back in 2006. Do you know what happened to her?" Gravel was quiet on the other end. Her name was Donna Marchetti. She moved out of the county after everything. Last I heard, she was over in Millfield, running some kind of alteration shop. "Is she okay?" "I don't know," Gravel said. I never followed up. A pause that carried its own weight in it. I should have. Yeah, Michael said. We should go see her. The pause this time was longer. You mean, you and me, Michael said. Before any of this goes further. Before the riding and the Saturday lunches and whatever else this turns into. We go see her and we tell her what Michael Jensen did and why it cost him what it cost him, and we make sure she knows that what Cal did to her was not ignored, that someone saw it. He stopped. That's the beginning. That's where it starts. Gravel said very quietly, yeah, okay, you're right. Wednesday, Michael said, I'll drive you navigate. You sure you don't want to take the bike? A careful question feeling for the edge of something. Michael looked at the bike across the garage. Not yet, he said, but soon. He heard Gravel breathe out a long, slow exhale that carried more than air in it. Wednesday, Gravel said. We'll go Wednesday. The week moved differently than the weeks before it. Michael noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, not in one dramatic moment, but in accumulation, in the way Tuesday felt different from Monday, in the way Wednesday morning arrived with a quality of intention that recent mornings had not had. He was up before 6 as always, but the rising had a direction to it now. He had somewhere to be. He had something on the other side of the day that required him to show up. He and Gravel drove to Millfield in Michael's truck. They did not talk about where they were going for the first 20 minutes. They talked about the road, about the construction Gravel had mentioned at the diner on that first Tuesday, about an interchange that had been rerouted badly and added 7 minutes to a drive that used to be clean. They talked the way men talk when they are letting the subject arrive at its own pace, rather than dragging it into the conversation by force. Then Gravel said, she doesn't know we're coming. I know, Michael said. She might not want to see us. I know that too. Okay, a pause. What are you going to say? Michael kept his eyes on the road. I'm going to tell her the truth, that a man named Cal Renner hurt her, and that I said something about it, and that it cost me some things, and that I am not telling her that, so she'll feel guilty, but so she'll know she was not invisible. That what happened to her was seen by at least one person who thought it was wrong. He paused. That's it, that's all. Gravel looked out the passenger window for a moment. You know, he said, you always were the best of us. Don't, Michael said, don't do that. I'm not complimenting you, Gravel said. I'm stating a fact. There's a difference. Michael didn't say anything, but something in his jaw eased slightly, and Gravel saw it and said nothing more about it, which was also the right thing to do. Donna Marchetti's alterations shop was on a side street off the main road in Millfield, the kind of small, self-sufficient place that runs on regulars and word of mouth and the specific trust that builds when you put something you care about in someone's hands and they treat it right. A small sign in the window, a bell on the door. She was 63, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had been through things and come out the other side with its dignity intact. She looked up when they walked in, and she looked at Michael first and then at Gravel, and Michael watched the moment she placed them, not personally but categorically, the way certain women of a certain experience place certain kinds of men, and he saw her decide in the space of 3 seconds whether to be afraid. She decided not to be. Help you, she said. My name is Michael Jensen, he said. I don't expect you to know that name, but I knew Cal Renner, and I knew what he did, and I came here to make sure you knew that too. Donna Marchetti looked at him for a long time. Then she set down what was in her hands and she said, close the door. He closed the door. They stayed for 40 minutes. Michael talked, Donna listened, and then Donna talked, and Michael listened, and the whole conversation was conducted in the particular register of people who have no reason to perform anything for each other. No history to maintain, no image to protect, just two people telling the truth in a small room with thread and fabric around them, and a bell on the door that didn't ring the whole time they were there. When they were done, Donna stood up and looked at Michael with an expression that was not gratitude exactly. It was beyond gratitude. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and has just been told for the first time that the weight was real, and it was witnessed, and they were not crazy for having felt it. Nobody ever came before, she said. I know, Michael said. I should have come sooner. She looked at him steadily. Well, she said, you came. He nodded. She held out her hand. He shook it. He and Gravel walked back out to the truck. They sat in the truck for a moment without starting it. The morning was quiet around them, and the street was empty, and the weight that had been sitting between them since Tuesday 3 weeks ago had not disappeared, but it had changed character. It was no longer the weight of something unresolved, but the weight of something that had been carried to its proper place and set down. Gravel said, "The bike ready yet?" "Almost," Michael said. "Another few days." "When it is," Gravel said, "you call me." "I will." He started the truck. He pulled out onto the main road. He drove and the miles went by, and the morning opened up around them clean and specific and moving forward the way mornings are supposed to move, the way they had not moved for Michael Jensen in a very long time. 10 days later, on a Saturday morning in early autumn, Michael Jensen rolled the bike out of the garage for the first time. Sarah was there. She stood in the driveway with her hands in her jacket pockets and watched her father check the tires, check the engine run through the sequence that muscle memory had preserved intact through 12 years of disuse. He did not hurry. He did not make a performance of it. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man reconnecting with something that had been waiting for him, something that had never fully believed he wasn't coming back. He put on the helmet. He threw his leg over the seat. He looked at Sarah. She was not crying. She was smiling, not the small, careful smile she used when she was managing something, but the full one, the one she had gotten from Linda, the one that arranged itself around a person and made them feel like everything was against considerable odds going to be all right. "Go," she said. He kicked it over. The engine turned, caught, sputtered, and then opened up into a sound that was not merely mechanical, but something that lived below the mechanical, the sound of something that had been silent too long finding its voice again. It roared and then settled into a steady, powerful idle, and Michael Jensen sat on his bike in his driveway on a Saturday morning and felt the vibration of it move up through his hands and into his chest, and he understood that what he was feeling was not happiness exactly. Not simple joy, but something more durable than either of those things. At the end of Hartley Road, 6 motorcycles appeared. They came slowly in their formation, and they stopped at the end of the driveway and waited. Not pushing forward, not assuming. Just there the way they had been there, that first night on the porch present, without demanding anything from the permanents except to be acknowledged. Gravel was at the front. He looked at Michael without speaking. Michael looked back at him. He looked at Dennis and Tommy, and the others behind them, 6 men who had failed him in a real and specific way and who had driven down a dead-end road every week since to prove that showing up even late, even imperfectly, was not nothing. He thought about Linda, who had believed in these men when she had no reason left to. He thought about Sarah, who had spent 8 months building a bridge in the dark with her own hands. He thought about Donna Marchetti, who had said, "Well, you came and meant it." He thought about Cal Renner's handwriting going uneven on the last page. He thought about 12 years and what they had taken and what, despite everything, they had not. He pulled out of the driveway. He fell into line behind Gravel, and the formation closed around him naturally without adjustment, like a space that had been kept empty on purpose, waiting for the shape that belonged in it. They rode down Hartley Road together, past the dead-end sign, out onto the open county road, where the morning was wide and the air was cool, and the horizon was exactly as far away as it always was, distant enough to keep moving toward, close enough to believe in. Michael Jensen did not ride toward his past that morning. He rode forward into the road ahead, into the season changing around him, into whatever version of himself was waiting on the other side of all that silence. And he rode without looking back, because the man who finally, after 12 years, had earned the right to face forward had no more use for the rearview mirror. The porch light burned behind him. It had done its job.